November 15th, 1966. Bumpy Johnson was supposed to die that night. The contract had been signed. The money had been paid. The assassin had been chosen. Everything was in place. Carmine Persico's people had given the order. Frank Costello's remaining allies wanted revenge. The Italian mafia had decided Harlem's king had lived long enough. But Bumpy Johnson didn't die that night. He didn't die that year. He didn't die until 1968. From natural causes at his own apartment, on his own terms, surrounded by the empire he'd built. And the reason he lived those extra 2 years, the reason he died a king instead of a corpse in some Harlem alley, was because of a woman nobody knew existed. A woman Bumpy never fully understood. A woman whose name was never mentioned in the streets, never whispered in the underworld, never documented in any police file. Her name was Dorothy. And this is the story of how one woman's quiet loyalty saved the most powerful black gangster in American history, and why Bumpy Johnson spent his final years never knowing the complete truth about who really protected him. Dorothy Mitchell arrived at Bumpy Johnson's brownstone on 147th Street every Tuesday and Friday morning at 7 o'clock sharp. For 8 years she'd maintained the residence, cleaned the floors, washed the linens, prepared the kitchen. She was invisible in the way servants become invisible, present but unremarkable, necessary but unnoticed. She was 42 years old, a widow with a daughter in nursing school. She'd worked as a domestic for wealthy families her entire adult life. Doctors, judges, businessmen. She understood discretion. She understood that what she saw in those homes remained in those homes. She understood that her position depended on her silence. Bumpy Johnson's household was like any other in that regard. She cleaned, she cooked occasional meals when the regular chef was absent, she maintained the residence. She was paid $60 a week. Substantial money in 1958 when she started, exceptional money by 1966. She never asked questions. She never gossiped. She never mentioned Bumpy's visitors or his business to anyone. But Dorothy wasn't invisible in the way Bumpy thought. She saw everything. And more importantly, she understood everything. She recognized the Italian mobsters who occasionally visited. She knew their faces from photographs in the newspapers. She understood the power dynamics in those conversations, the tension, the threats barely concealed beneath diplomatic language. She listened while pretending to dust. She observed while arranging flowers. She processed while wiping countertops. By 1966, Dorothy had accumulated 8 years of secret intelligence. She knew which visitors made Bumpy uncomfortable. She knew which conversations ended with agreements and which ended with threats. She knew the rhythm of Bumpy's empire. When it expanded, when it contracted, when external pressure increased, she also knew something else, something that nobody in the underworld comprehended. Dorothy knew Bumpy Johnson's vulnerability. The brownstone's architecture worked against its owner. Multiple entry points, windows accessible from fire escapes, a kitchen that connected to both the main residence and the back entrance, a bedroom positioned in a location where an assassin could position themselves on an adjacent rooftop. Dorothy, who'd spent 8 years cleaning every corner, understood the geography of death better than most security consultants. She'd never mentioned this to anyone. She'd never suggested improvements. She'd never expressed concern. She simply observed and understood, and she waited for the moment when her observations might matter. That moment arrived in November 1966. Dorothy was preparing the kitchen for Bumpy's evening meal when she heard the visitor arrive. The doorbell rang at 5:30 in the afternoon. Unusual timing. Most of Bumpy's business occurred late evening or early morning. Daytime visitors were rare and generally significant. She didn't see the visitor's face. She remained in the kitchen, performing her duties with meticulous attention. But she heard the conversation. Voices carried through the brownstone's interior. Bumpy's measured tone. The visitor's agitated energy. The visitor said. Dorothy's hands stilled over the vegetables she was preparing. She forced herself to continue, chopping, arranging, maintaining normalcy while processing the implications of what she'd heard. Bumpy's voice remained calm, controlled, the voice of someone accustomed to processing terminal information without emotional reaction. Between 9 and 10, after dark, he'll come through the back entrance, the alley access, the fire escape window in the bedroom. One shot, that's all it takes. By the time the police arrive, he'll be gone. Dorothy's mind worked rapidly. Fire escape window. Bedroom access. 9 to 10 p.m. Tomorrow evening. She continued chopping vegetables, but her consciousness had shifted entirely into a different operational mode. Bumpy asked. Quote 5. The conversation continued, but Dorothy had already processed the essential information. Tomorrow night, approximately 9 to 10. Back entrance, fire escape. She'd heard enough. The visitor departed. Bumpy returned to his study. Dorothy completed her meal preparation and served dinner to Bumpy as though nothing had occurred. She'd learned long ago that crisis management required complete normalcy. Any deviation in behavior, any indication of awareness, could prove catastrophic. She finished her duties at 7 p.m. and departed the brownstone. She walked to the subway station, she boarded a train heading toward Brooklyn, and she began making decisions that would determine whether Bumpy Johnson lived or died. Dorothy understood something fundamental about power structures. Information was currency. Knowledge was leverage. And she possessed both. But she needed to convert them into actionable security. She couldn't involve the police. Bumpy's organization had infiltrated law enforcement at multiple levels, but that same infiltration meant unpredictable elements existed within the system. She couldn't guarantee police response would protect rather than complicate. She couldn't mention this to Bumpy directly. His response would be predictable, defensive, possibly aggressive, likely involving confrontation that could precipitate rather than prevent the assassination. She needed to operate within the margins. She needed to move information through channels that would trigger security responses without exposing her knowledge or violating the confidentiality boundaries that defined her position. By the time Dorothy reached Brooklyn, she'd formulated a plan. It was dangerous. It was potentially illegal. It violated everything she'd spent a lifetime maintaining: discretion, invisibility, separation from the underworld's operational machinery, but it was the only plan that might work. Dorothy found a telephone booth in a Flatbush neighborhood she didn't know. She called a number she'd memorized years earlier, a number that appeared on various documents Bumpy kept in his study, a number associated with a man named Marcus, one of Bumpy's lieutenants, a connection point between the legitimate world and the criminal organization. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered. Quote, quote, 7, quote, quote, 9. Silence occupied the line. Dorothy could hear background noise. Calculation occurring on the other end. She waited 5 minutes, 10. Her coins were running low in the pay telephone. She inserted additional money and waited. Marcus's voice eventually displaced the silence. "Who the hell is this and what do you know?" Dorothy spoke quickly. She provided the timeline. The assassin arrival prediction, the entry methodology, the window access, the timing, 9 to 10 p.m. She didn't mention how she'd obtained the information. She simply transmitted the intelligence with clinical precision. "This is specific," Marcus said when she finished. "How do you know this?" "I know because I listen, and I understand what I'm listening to. That's all that matters. What matters is that Bumpy needs to know someone's coming tomorrow night. Someone professional, someone Italian, someone hired by Carmine Persico. If you're lying, if this is some kind of setup, I'm not lying. I'm risking everything by making this call. Check the information, verify it, but do it quietly. Because if Carmine knows someone warned Bumpy, the timeline accelerates. The assassination happens tonight instead of tomorrow." Marcus absorbed this. "What's your name?" "No. No names. I'm someone who cleans his house. I'm someone who will return to cleaning his house next Tuesday. I'm someone who wants to keep her job and keep breathing. That's all you need to know." She disconnected before Marcus could respond. She exited the telephone booth and walked into the Brooklyn evening, her heart accelerating with the understanding of what she'd just initiated. By the time Dorothy arrived home, word had already propagated through Bumpy Johnson's organization. Marcus had initiated security protocols. Bumpy's residence was being fortified. Personnel were being positioned. The brownstone was transforming from a residence into a fortress. Bumpy never received a specific name. He never learned the identity of his informant. Marcus simply communicated that credible intelligence suggested an assassination attempt scheduled for the following evening. He presented the information without revealing source documentation. He implemented defensive measures without explaining their origin. Bumpy accepted the warning. He'd survived enough assassination attempts to recognize credibility when he heard it. He'd built his empire on the assumption that enemies perpetually sought his elimination. He'd adapted his security protocols accordingly. The next evening, the Italian assassin arrived from Brooklyn exactly as predicted. He approached the brownstone with professional methodology. He identified the fire escape. He prepared to access the bedroom window. What he discovered was a residence transformed into a defensive position. Personnel positioned on rooftops. Personnel inside the structure. Personnel in alleyways. The window he'd planned to access was reinforced. The apartment beyond was fortified. The assassin recognized immediately that his mission had been compromised. He retreated. He departed Brooklyn. He reported back to Carmine Persico that the operation had been aborted due to security complications. Carmine Persico never ordered another assassination attempt on Bumpy Johnson. The failed operation suggested that Bumpy's intelligence network had expanded beyond previous understanding. The failed operation suggested that someone within Persico's organization had leaked information. The failed operation created uncertainty that discouraged future attempts. And Bumpy Johnson lived. He lived another 2 years. He lived long enough to see Frank Lucas establish himself as the new power in Harlem. He lived long enough to mentor Frank through the critical early months of succession. He lived long enough to consolidate the empire in ways that ensured its survival beyond his own existence. He died in July 1968 at his own apartment on his own terms from natural causes. He died a king. And he never knew that a cleaning lady had saved his life. Dorothy continued her employment at the brownstone. She continued arriving every Tuesday and Friday morning. She continued cleaning and maintaining and observing. She continued existing in that state of invisible visibility that defined her existence. Bumpy appreciated her work. He occasionally complimented her attention to detail. He increased her salary twice without explanation. He seemed to sense that she possessed qualities that transcended simple domestic service. But he never questioned her directly. He never asked about her intelligence sources. He never comprehended the complete picture of how she'd protected him. After Bumpy's death, Dorothy continued working for Frank Lucas during the early phases of his ascendancy. She maintained the brownstone. She observed Frank's operations with the same careful attention she devoted to Bumpy. She listened to conversations. She understood power dynamics. She processed information. But she never intervened again. Her single act of intervention had been sufficient. She'd proven to herself and to the universe that she could act when intervention became necessary. She'd satisfied whatever internal imperative had driven her to make that telephone call in 1966. Dorothy eventually retired in 1972. She'd saved enough money to assist her daughter through additional nursing education. She'd established a small apartment of her own in a respectable neighborhood. She'd removed herself from the underworld's operational machinery. She never spoke publicly about her role in saving Bumpy Johnson's life. She never mentioned it to her daughter. She never documented it anywhere. The secret remained her exclusive possession. Years later, after both Bumpy and Frank Lucas had passed away, a researcher conducting interviews about Harlem's criminal history encountered Dorothy. She was elderly by then, living quietly, maintaining the discretion that had defined her entire existence. The researcher, curious about the cleaning lady's perspective on Bumpy Johnson, posed a simple question. Did you ever feel like you were part of his organization? Part of the empire? Dorothy considered the question carefully. She chose her response with the precision that had characterized every word she'd ever spoken about her employment. Quote 20, she said, finally. Quote 21. Quote 22, the researcher asked. Dorothy smiled, a sad, knowing expression that suggested depths of understanding earned through decades of observation. Quote 23. The researcher pressed further. Quote 24. Dorothy shook her head. Quote 25. She paused, looking toward a window where afternoon sunlight illuminated an ordinary urban landscape. Quote 26. The researcher never published the complete interview. He included fragments, brief references to Bumpy's domestic staff, and the observation that significant figures often failed to comprehend the infrastructure sustaining their authority. But he omitted the woman's identity. He honored her request for anonymity. Dorothy lived until 1995. She died of natural causes in her sleep, alone in the apartment she'd purchased with money earned from cleaning the homes of powerful men. Her obituary was unremarkable. She was remembered by her daughter and grandchildren. She was forgotten by history. But somewhere in the margins of Harlem's criminal history, invisible and unacknowledged, Dorothy's intervention persisted. Her single telephone call in 1966 had altered the trajectory of an empire. Had she not made that call, Bumpy Johnson would have died 5 years before his actual death. Frank Lucas would have inherited chaos rather than consolidated structure. The entire landscape of Harlem's power dynamics would have evolved differently, all because a cleaning lady listened carefully and understood what she'd heard. In the years after Bumpy's death, people speculated about his security apparatus. They discussed his network of informants. They analyzed his intelligence-gathering methodology. They attributed his longevity to his own strategic brilliance and operational awareness. Nobody ever mentioned the cleaning lady. Nobody ever comprehended that the woman who dusted his furniture and washed his linens had been his most effective intelligence asset. Nobody ever recognized that invisible infrastructure, the people we overlook, the servants we fail to see, the humans we consider inconsequential, often constitute the actual foundation upon which power structures rest. That was Dorothy's legacy. Not recognition, not acknowledgement, not historical documentation, but the knowledge held privately that she'd mattered, that her actions had consequences, that one person operating quietly within the margins could alter the course of empires. She never sought validation for that knowledge. She never needed public acknowledgement. She simply lived her life, performed her duties, and carried her secret with the same meticulous care she devoted to maintaining Bumpy Johnson's brownstone. And perhaps that was the most powerful lesson embedded in her story. Not that great people deserve protection, but that protection itself, when given purely and without expectation of recognition, becomes the most authentic expression of human value. Bumpy Johnson never knew he'd been saved by a cleaning lady. He never understood the infrastructure that sustained his survival. He never comprehended that the woman who arrived Tuesday and Friday mornings possessed knowledge that could determine whether he lived or died. But that invisibility, that complete absence of acknowledgement, was precisely what made Dorothy's protection so effective. She existed in the margins, noticed but unobserved, present but unremarkable, and in those margins she became powerful in ways that transcended traditional understandings of power. This is the story of how one woman's quiet loyalty saved Harlem's king, and why Bumpy Johnson died, never knowing the complete truth about who really protected him.